This is the Kingdom Movement Podcast, a place where we will explore, through conversation, how discipleship, theology, and community really can transform our world. Hey guys, this is Jake Johnson back with another episode of the Kingdom Movement Podcast. And today I just want to maybe talk about the idea of the art or the practice of creating space for God, right? Because I think all of us in our hearts, if we're wanting to follow Jesus, want to create space for Him in our lives. But I think all of us would admit that we at times, at moments, and maybe consistently do a really bad job of this, really creating opportunities and just an openness for God to move, to speak, to really put aside the other things that are occupying our thoughts and our lives and our actions and ultimately our days in the pursuit of wanting to take time in God's presence. So today's episode, we're going to talk about maybe a little bit of some of the issues and some of the practices that can help us create the space that we need, not just even to spend time in God's presence, but also to learn to just create margin and space in our lives. Because the reality is like we live in an ever increasingly busy world. Like it's funny that we make technology to make our lives simpler or easier, to communicate, to make food, to bathe, to travel. It has never been faster, never more efficient in human history, and yet we are exceedingly more busy, filling our lives with more and more activity than we ever have before, even though our lives are simplified in a lot of ways. And I think there is no doubt a correlation to why we are the most anxious, tired, exhausted generation that there is, because with our efficiency, we have not created more space to live in enjoyment and in peace and in rest and ultimately in God's presence, but we've just filled that time with more busyness, more activity, more productivity, and really we're seeing that like the human being, regardless of the myth of trying to overcome our limits, has limits. We have a capacity of the load that we can carry, the amount of work that we can take on, and I think that plays a huge role and a huge part in why we are facing the things that we are, why we feel the way that we feel. And so we want to talk about that a little bit. So one of the most important ways is like we have to create meaningful space for Jesus. But if you notice, like, unless you're intentional about that, like even your prayer time or your Bible reading or just quiet space in God's presence, like if we're not careful, that just becomes one other burden. A burden, really, if we're really honest and true, in our cramped schedule. We think like, how can I even fit this in here? Like, I'm a full-time student, I'm a son, I have responsibilities, I'm a daughter. When I get home, my parents want me to do dishes, they want me to do chores, they want me to do this and that, and I have to study, I have to go to school, I have to travel, I want to see my friends, and all of a sudden, that's just the life of a student, let alone, some who are listening here are probably parents. They have full-time jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Like we realize like to make space for God, it can feel like we have to cram, in a sense, Jesus into our busy schedule. But I want us to take a step back and evaluate like, is that really the priority? Is Jesus, if we are just cramming Him into our schedules, has Jesus really become Lord of our lives? Is He really the number one priority of our life? But the good news is this, our lives, our practices, our habits, our schedules don't have to be this way. But how do we do that, right? One of the most powerful verses, and I think powerful lessons that we can learn is from the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount when He tells His disciples who are listening, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And what does this have to do with busyness? What does this have to do with creating space and margin in our lives? Well, Jesus is basically saying in that compact statement is we often use language, we often use requests as a way to leverage relationship, to leverage guilt, to leverage shame, to get what we want, in a sense. How many of you know that someone probably doesn't want to do something, but using, language that kind of yeah, maybe I can make that work, or I'll see if my schedule allows it, or, we use cloaked language like that because we're afraid to let our yes, I have space, yes, I have time, yes, I want to do that, yes, I need to do that, or no, I can't do that, no, I'm sorry, like I don't have space, I don't have margin for that in my lives, no, I think that's a great thing, a really good thing, but that's not where I feel like God is calling me. Instead of being honest, we often cloak our language, or we say yes when really in our hearts we want to say no, or we mean no. And so whether well-intentioned or not, we end up being an involuntary volunteer. And really, that isn't helpful for anybody. So that's what I want to talk about. The art of learning to say no to good things and not God things. So what does that mean? There are plenty of wonderful, great, good, amazing things that are happening in this world, whether it's, certain aspects or volunteering opportunities in your church, in your community, whether it's feeding the homeless or helping make meals for those who've just had a baby, or maybe there's a wedding planning, or there's this event, or there's this sports team, or there's this chess team, or there's this cool opportunity in the business club, or there's this opportunity to travel and go here. There are tons and tons and tons. And sorry, I should mention a more common, even going and hanging out with your friends and having a chill night on a Friday night. There are endless opportunities around us for good things, for things that bring us life, things that bring us joy, and obligations, things that we feel compelled to do because of the value we hold with certain relationships, whether it's a wedding that's 7 hours away, like I don't know if I'd want to travel 7 hours away for a wedding, but if this person really means something to me, I feel obligated to do that, right? And so one of the things that we have to learn to discern is what to say no to and what to say yes to. And really, some of those come down to good things and God things. And before we do this, I want to give a caveat. This does not mean that we have permission to be selfish. It doesn't mean that we have permission to basically do whatever makes us feel good or whatever is easiest for us. There are times when the God things require sacrifice, require burden, require suffering, require us to die to ourselves to do something good for another. So there are plenty of opportunities where the God thing requires us to do something hard, difficult, or maybe lose out on an opportunity that we would actually rather do. But there are also times where we take on things in our lives that God never really intended us to participate in. Not that they were bad, not that they were evil or wrong or anything like that. They were actually good things. They were things that were positive and encouraging, but we didn't consult God on if that was something that we should create space for in our lives. So the first question when any opportunity is presented to us is, have we prayed for God to give us direction to engage in this area? So a great example of this might be you want to get involved, or a music opportunity comes up. You are a musician or an artist or a manager, and you have the opportunity to be a part of this, right? That's a wonderful opportunity. But is that something that God is desiring you to be a part of? Because maybe your life is already filled to the margin, to the brim. Or whether you're in business, or you're a student, or you're a parent, maybe there's a sports team or an extracurricular activity, or your church has a service every night of the week. And we can feel obligated to do those things without ever consulting if God has asked us to participate in those. And so I think a great first step is, have we asked God for direction in this area of our life? Is this a space where we feel like the Holy Spirit is leading us to make an impact? Because if so, then God has purposes and plans for us in that area, right? And a good example of maybe a hard thing was kind of like the wedding example. We have people who mean a lot to us, right? And maybe one of them is getting married and is 7 hours away, and you think, man, I got a test next week, and I really don't want to drive this 7 hours, and I know this is going to take my whole weekend of studying, but this relationship means a ton to you. Well, in the kingdom of God, we honor each other, we love each other, we sacrifice for each other. So there are times, right, where that is something that is required of us in order to love our brother and sister. But a big first step is, have we even taken into consideration God and his opinion on this activity that we are considering? Second of all, are we saying yes because of obedience to Jesus? So when we do say yes, are we saying yes because we want to obey Jesus, or are we doing it out of fear of man's opinion, right? And what I mean by this is there are opportunities, even in our churches, where we've been asked to volunteer, we've been asked to give our time, and oftentimes in our heart of hearts, we're not doing this out of an obedience to Jesus of, yes, I want to do this because I want to honor God, because I believe this is what Jesus is asking me to do. This is an area of engagement that I'm passionate about, or I feel like God has specifically asked me to step into. But we're doing it out of fear of man. We're afraid of other people's opinions. What will the pastor think of me? What will this leader think of me? What will my friends think of me? What will the church think of me? What will, my parents think of me? And so when we say yes from those perspectives of fear of man rather than fear of God, it often determines our motivation, our efforts, and our attitude, like when things get hard, right? When things are easy, we can enjoy those good things. We can see, like when we get a nice plate of meat after an event and we're like, all right, this was worth it. I got a nice free meal. But there are times where it's like, what do you mean I got to do 4 hours of cleanup after this event and set up, and no one's grateful and no one's thankful, and they're actually just already moving on to the next thing that they want me to do. Like in those hard moments, if we're operating from a place of obedience to Jesus, we can put up with the hard. We can, say, yes, I know that this is where God has me, what he wants me to do. And so I get it. Like I'm not doing this for other people's opinions. But when we're living in fear of other people's opinions, our motivations are skewed, our attitudes can be corrupted, we can begin to get angry and bitter towards the same people that asked us to volunteer because they aren't valuing us, they aren't treating us like they should. And so we have to be really, really careful of what is our motivation when we say yes to certain things. Are we doing it for our own glory? Are we doing it because we think this will, shine the light on us, make us look good, make us look like the kind of persona that we want to display in front of other people? And if so, we have to understand that we are now our yes has now become a tool to manipulate other people, to show them a part of ourselves that is actually false, that we aren't really genuinely wanting to do this out of the goodness or obedience to Jesus, but we're doing it to make ourselves look good. And so we have to filter our yeses through, is this being obedient to Jesus and what I know, this is important, what I know he would want me to do? Because there are times where you may not have a clear, distinct answer from the Holy Spirit, but it aligns with love, right? That you're walking in love towards this person. But there are other times where we can allow the fear of what other people have to think and say about us manipulate us into situations and opportunities that maybe aren't great for us. So we have to stop and consider as well. I think this is a really important point, that is our yes taking away space for someone God has intended to place in that opportunity? So something that was really interesting that one of my youth leaders said to me growing up was, one of my friends mentioned that I should join the worship team in youth, and I would not be the lead singer, let's say that, but maybe I can carry a tune in the background. But I remember my youth leader turning to both of us, and I was actively involved in my youth group. I was heavily involved in other areas. So it wasn't like I wasn't doing anything and here was an opportunity to do something. I was already doing a lot. And I remember my youth leader saying to me, yes, Jake could do that, but he would be taking away an opportunity from someone who has a real passion for worship, who has a real passion to use music as a gift that God has given them. And he would just be doing it to do it. And that was true. This youth leader knew me well enough to know that that was the reality. And that has stuck with me, probably 15, 16 years later, where there are opportunities that come across our path that if we say yes to them out of obligation, or just because we think it would be fun, or just because we think it's a good opportunity and not a God opportunity, and it's clear that it's not in the direction that God is taking us, we could actually be robbing opportunities for people who have a real passion and a gift that God would like to develop in that area. And so we have to take into consideration our yes isn't just taking away from our time and our energy and our focus, but it could be robbing someone else of the opportunity to grow in their giftings that God has for them. And that's not to say that God isn't sovereign or that he can't work it out, but we also have to understand that our actions have consequences. And when we feel like we have to carry the burden of the world on our shoulders, whether it's in our families or in our churches or in our school community, when we feel like we have to be the person that everyone looks to, we're actually robbing other people of the opportunity to step up into responsibility, to grow in their own path where God is leading them. So we have to understand, like, our yeses have consequences, not just for us, but for other people. I think ultimately, like, learning to say no, to have the grace, to have the gift that we can actually say no to good opportunities, fun opportunities, opportunities that we would enjoy if we actually participated in them. Like, sometimes dedication to being a good student and getting rest means saying no to hanging out, right? Opportunities to grow closer to Jesus, to basically spend time in his presence and not be exhausted, may mean saying no to staying up and watching that show after studying for 2 hours, keeping you up till 2 a.m., and going to bed at a reasonable time so that you can get up and spend time with the Lord. And really, our no's, and this is wild, our no's can actually be one of the greatest gifts that we give to God. Because when we allow ourselves to say no, we can create space for his presence, for him, right? And so when we stop basically, in a way, doing things just for God and begin to spend time with God, we realize, like, this is what God has desired all along. Not that we are slaves that just work for him and do all these things for him, but that he desires to be with us. And so I think that's a really powerful tool that we have to develop in our lives to create space. The ability to say no to good opportunities and not God opportunities, for multiple reasons. And I'll just summarize that real quick. To create margin in our own lives, so to create the space that we need, right, to be healthy, to be whole, to not have our motivations mixed, right? It's an opportunity to practice obedience over fear of man, over the opinion of others, to really die to self, right? To learn to care more about what God has to say about us than what other people have to say about us. It's also an opportunity not to rob someone else of what God maybe wants to develop in them. And it's also a gift to God. It's an ability to give to him our time, our lives, our space, to say to him, like, these good things don't mean more to me than you, God. And I'm willing to sacrifice being on YouTube for 2 hours a day, and I'm exhausted in the morning, so that I can have space for you, Lord, because you are more important. And that takes work, that takes practice, that takes creating the habits and the rhythms in our lives. And I think that leads to kind of the second point that I want to talk about, creating intentional space, right? The reality is we all have time. When we say, oh, I don't have time to do that, what we really mean is I am not going to create and make the space for that because I have other things that I want to create and make space for. Because we all have time. We all have 24 hours in the day, and we all have the ability to say no and to say yes. We all have the ability to value certain things over others. And we need that skill. We need that life skill, because the reality is you have to value studying over sleep if you want to be a good student at times, right? Like, that's just the conscious choice you have to make. And in the same way, we have to be intentional. We have to purposely set aside time to actually spend time in God's presence if we want to be with him, right? Just like any other relationship. You know, a lot of times I talk with students in Kingdom Movement, and they tell me, like, I don't want to be in a relationship because I don't have the time, right? And what they mean is, My life is busy with school, with family obligations, with so many other things that I don't have the margin to invest in a relationship like I should. And the same thing goes with our relationship with God. Unless we are willing to cut things out of our lives to create the margin for Him, we will inevitably not have a relationship with God, not because He doesn't want one with us, but because we have not created the space for that to happen. So, what we can do and what's really helpful is we can actually use our time management, so like what we are investing our time in, as a gauge of our true loves. So when we look at our lives, when we look at what we're spending time on, what we're investing in, what we spend our money on, what we think about in our minds, what we do in our free time, what we focus on, when our minds drift away, what we invest our time in, what we make space for, what we prioritize, all these things can help us recognize what our true loves are. What do we really value? Not what we say we value, because what we say and what we do can often not be aligned. But what we actually do with our real lives oftentimes can reveal to us what we really value in our lives. And this is helpful because, like anything else, in order to change, we have to be real with ourselves. We have to actually diagnose ourselves correctly. Just like any sort of disease, you can't fix the disease until you know what it is. And a bad diagnosis, or incorrect diagnosis, is actually more dangerous, right, than not knowing the problem, because then you might not have the right medicine. You might not take the right solution to your problem. So diagnosing ourselves, diagnosing our lives, and understanding like even good things, whether it's sleep or entertainment, or more negative things like phone addiction or fear, specifically fear of failure, I know is a big thing for students. Others' opinions, even our own family, can become an idol of our attention if we are not careful. And so we have to recognize like there are many, many things trying to claim our loyalties, trying to claim our time, trying to claim our attention. And ultimately, if Jesus is going to be Lord of our lives, we have to create space for Him over and above these things. That doesn't always mean even that He has to have 5 hours of our day and school only has 30 minutes. But what it means is we are creating intentional time with God, and then we are inviting Him into the space of those other things, right? And I think that's what's amazing about God is He's not asking that we spend 7 hours in prayer and 2 hours in sleep and 2 hours on school. But what He's saying is, I want intentional time with you, just like any significant relationship in your life would want. But also that significant relationship often engages in those same activities that bring you joy. And so the other way we can think about it is, how do we bring God into those positive activities, but also recognize like what are the potential idols in our lives, and idols being what takes our attention, what takes our time, what takes our focus, mainly when our minds wander. So, not all idols are like these malicious beings or dark creatures, but some of them are good things, right, that have become disordered loves in our hearts and our lives. So really creating or carving out intentional space for God in our day shows in a small act of obedience, right, that we can rest because we trust that time in God's presence can actually do more than like our own strength, our own efforts. And I think that's really, really important. I know like that was the whole intention of the practice of Sabbath, was the rest of the world worked 7 days a week and actually mocked the Jews for taking a day off. But Sabbath was meant to teach them that really God is on the throne, God is in control, and for 6 days you have the opportunity to do what you need to do, to put in the work, to put in the effort. And on the seventh day, just like your heavenly Father, you can rest assured knowing that He will take care of it. And in the same way, I think God desires for us to understand that like when we take time and space for Him, it's actually not going to rob us of what we need to do, but often it can energize us and empower us and strengthen us for the task, not only that He has for us, but just in daily life in general, that like when we spend time in His presence, there is a rest, there's a joy, there is a peace, there is a hope that no amount of sleep, no amount of vacations, no amount of entertainment or checking out of busyness can do for us. That God's presence provides us something that unless we are spending it with Him, we will continue to feel starved. We will continue to feel restless and anxious because our lives are meant to rest in Him. And so creating intentional space for that to happen is vital. So the third and kind of final point that I want to talk about today in the episode is being intentional about a routine and then sticking to it. So like human beings are not meant to live in chaos. We are not chaotic beings. I don't care how spontaneous you are. I don't care how, like let's go on an adventure today and hike. Like, yes, there are those people that need to break up their routine, the monotony. But the reality is all of us, no matter what, crave a routine, crave some sort of pattern that we can have in our lives that we know is almost like a comfort that we can live into. And oftentimes, we can live out of routine. We can live out of that comfort space. We often cannot do it for an extended period of time without needing to retreat back to our routine. So the reality is, though, that unless we are intentional about this routine, we can find that the demands of life can pull us in so many directions that we begin to just feel restless and never at ease, because life, if we let it, will pull us in a million different directions. Like we've talked about multiple times, there are opportunities all around us. And unless we have a routine, unless we have a rhythm, a pattern, a way of rest, a way of limiting ourselves and the opportunities that we have, we can get pulled in so many directions that we no longer feel as though we have any sort of space, any sort of comfort to go back to. So creating daily touch points with God and just with rest and with space and with a margin and sticking to them can give our minds and our bodies and our inner beings that is what is going to give us the rhythm of life to live by. And really, your life is not determined. At the end of the day, John Mark Comer, one of my favorite pastors and theologians, talks about you want to live most of us live for our resumes. We live to create a list of accomplishments that we've done. But often, what is read at our funeral is not our resume, but our eulogy. And the eulogy is more about who you have become. Who are you to the people that mean the most to you? And really, that is what life is all about. It's not about creating these resumes. One day, your resume is not going to matter. It doesn't matter when you're dead and gone. Your kids aren't going to care that you were the CEO of a big company and made millions and millions of dollars. What they're going to care about is, were you a person that cared about them, loved them, honored other people, honored those around you, treated them with kindness and respect, modeled the life of Jesus to them? And in reality, our lives, our rhythms need to be shaped more about what is our eulogy rather than our resume. And so that's what it's about, creating touch points, creating a rhythm that is centered around the person of Jesus and how he lived in tune with the Father. So with that in mind, when we create those daily touch points, we also have to, gain the courage to say no. We have to create the space and be intentional about setting aside time for our responsibilities, and basically becoming a person that is confident in what God has for them and what they can say no to. Because the reality is some of the most confident people in the world are people who can say no and they don't feel bad about it. I'm assuming most of you have met someone like that, right? They have no qualms about saying no to some things and yes to others because they understand what their capacity and their limits are, and they understand the direction that they want to go in. And that's for secular people and for people who would follow Jesus. But some of the most successful people in life in general understand the direction, for us as Christians, where God is leading us. And so we have the ability to say no because we know what God has given us and what isn't our responsibility. Because the truth is, none of us can feed the homeless, can take care of all our city's ills, be the person at the church that can solve all the problems, fix all the issues, have all the answers, and also be a good parent, a good spouse, a good friend, a good family member, a good follower of Jesus. We just can't do all of it. And Jesus doesn't want us to. Jesus wants us to live in obedience to what he has asked us to do and to trust him for the rest, that he will raise up people in those different spaces. And that doesn't mean that we can't at times encourage or help or speak life into each other's lives, but really gaining the courage to say no, to create space and intentionality, that is what is going to create a non-anxious life, a life of rest, right? That even when we go through stress, because all of us are going to have stress, all of us are going to have burdens and responsibilities at times. But when we create the margin, we have those touch points with God where we can take our burdens to him, we can rest in him, and we know the direction that he has for us. So it's a life that does not live outside its limits, right? Because we all have them, but rather lives with humility. So living within your limits is an act of humility. It's saying that I can't do it all, and trust that we can't do it all, right? So this idea of living in our limits is really saying to God, I trust you, and I understand who I am, and I understand who you are. It also frees us from the opinion of others. We've talked about that. But it's like we are free to live in obedience to Jesus over the expectation of what other people have for us. So we can learn like what to fear God actually looks like, and it actually gives us freedom and peace. Fear of God is not something where we cower before God's presence, although there is a reverence that we need to give him. But it's more about understanding that like we honor and fear what God has to say about us far more than what other people have to say about us. And that's a confidence, that's a trust, that's a peace of like, I know who God has created me to be, and I can walk in that with confidence, and I don't have to care if other people, want to nag or gossip or say this and that about me, because I know who God has created me to be. And I think really that can become an invitation for other people to recognize that they too can have that confidence, that life, that love, and we can walk in an understanding of what God has for each of us and honor one another. And so I think those are just some great ways that we can begin to learn the art of creating intentional space, learning how to say no to good opportunities but not God opportunities, creating margin in our lives for God, whether it's an intentional quiet time, cutting out things, potential idols in our lives, to create space because we want to be with God, and then sticking to our routines, creating rhythms and habits in our lives that are important, that we need, that are going to draw us closer to Jesus and to those that we love, and sticking with them. Obviously there are times where we have to break those routines, but when we get back to our space, we go back to that, we find that rest, we find that rhythm, and we allow that to be the touchstone where God can meet us and allow us to gain confidence in the life he has given us. So I hope this episode was encouraging to you guys. I know that's a challenge for all of us, especially as students on universities. There are constant demands, and sometimes your schedule, sometimes your workload, not sometimes, all the time, is not always lenient or leans on you, right? Sometimes your professor drops something on your plate, but the rhythm and the daily practice and the ability to trust in God and create margin and space for him will help us kind of wade through those storms of life, wade through those pressure situations in a different way than someone who's panicked and anxious already. Like that workload just becomes another burden to carry. But when we have space and margin in our lives, rest in our lives, we can carry those things and they won't break us. They won't overload us. So I hope this episode is at least giving you some tools, some helpful guidelines on how to live with margin, how to live with space, how to live with more rest. And can't wait to drop another episode, and more importantly, can't wait to see you guys, to be back in Botswana, to encourage the community there. We're praying for you, all the students at UB and BAC and around Botswana, and we're so thankful that we get to do this. It is a huge blessing for Vanessa and I, and so we miss our Kingdom Movement family, and we will catch you on the next pod. Hey guys, this is Jake. If you are currently a university student on a campus in Botswana, we want to extend an invitation to you to get plugged into a discipleship group. So if you're interested, if that's something you want to do, if you want to begin to be a part of this family we call Kingdom Movement, we would encourage you to go into this episode's bio. There should be a link to our Instagram page. You can send us a message, and we will make sure to connect you at a time and a place that works best for you and your schedule for school. But we don't want you to miss this opportunity to get plugged in and a part of what God is doing on the university campuses here, because we believe that you're a vital piece to what God wants to do to bring his kingdom, his wholeness, and his healing to the nation of Botswana and to the university specifically. So reach out to us today, guys, if that's something you're interested in. All right, thanks.